Okay, so I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to the panel on inequality, the media, and the elections. There's plenty of seats in the front for all you people in the back. Please have a seat. I'm Anya Schiffrin. I'm the director of the International Media, Advocacy, and Communications Specialization. And I'd like to thank Esther Fuchs and Molly Morgan-Rusk and Kevin and Meishi Gan and the U.S. program and the Urban Studies program for helping organize this event along with IMAC. We usually, both of our specializations, always organize a number of events around the election. So we're already planning. Here's Dean Jano, welcome. We have a seat for you right in the front with your name on it. So we always plan a number of events around the elections. We'll be doing one in the fall with foreign correspondents, talking about what it's like to cover the elections. I see some of our students here. And I know Esther Fuchs' Jacob Weisberg coming in a couple of weeks as well to talk about his new book on Reagan. So I'm really glad to see everybody. And I know that all of us talk about the elections all the time, and all our friends from overseas, when they see us, the first thing they do is ask us about the elections. Everyone goes, "What is happening with Trump?" We were in Europe recently, and someone said when Obama was elected, the world loved us, and now everybody hates us because of what's going on. To prepare, I actually read this wonderful book by Alan Brinkley about Huey Long and Father Coughlin, and I can't recommend it enough to anybody who's wondering what are the kind of historic roots of what we're seeing today. Some of you may not remember who Huey Long and Father Coughlin were, but they were sort of populist politicians who gained popularity in 1934. They made extensive use of radio and newspapers to gather support. Coughlin supported nationalizing the banks and wanted a whole new financial order, partly because he was a raging anti-Semite who thought that the banks were controlled by the Jews. Huey Long wanted to tax the Louisiana oil companies heavily, and he invested in infrastructure and textbooks for the schools. So like Donald Trump's followers, the followers of Huey Long and Father Coughlin were the frightened middle class who felt that they were losing ground and were afraid of their jobs. And these are, of course, the very people who often support populist movements in the United States. And in the US, when people are unhappy and insecure, they don't necessarily look to government for solutions. They support protest candidates who express and give voice to their insecurities. The media plays a role in amplifying these voices of protest and in publicizing the candidates' messages. So it's a really interesting time to look at how the fear about inequality is covered by the media and how it's playing into the current campaign. Many of you know our speakers. Michael Massing is a well-known media critic. He's very generous with his time and comes to SIPA regularly. Years ago, we even had him teaching here, but it's hard to persuade him because you're
on a panel 4 years ago.
About the elections, absolutely.
That's true.
That's right. Michael founded the Committee to Protect Journalists, and he was a contributing editor for years to Columbia Journalism Review and is on the masthead of New York Review of Books. So many of you will read his work there. Okay, well, you're one of the regular contributors.
If they did.
Patricia Cohen has been at the New York Times for 18 years, and in her most recent beat is economics correspondent. You may have remembered one of the most emailed stories of last year was one of Patty's stories about what would happen if the rich actually paid taxes. What could we do with the money? And it turned out a huge amount, actually. It's really quite a lot. You know Joseph Stiglitz. He's been writing about inequality since his PhD thesis in 1969. And he's written a book called The Price of Inequality. And for a couple of years, he had a New York Times blog called The Great Divide, which was very widely read. He's been doing, now there's obviously Thomas Piketty and other people are writing about inequality, but they've done a lot to bring their sort of inequality discussion to the mainstream. So Joe can not just talk about it from an economic perspective, but also how we've seen the media kind of amplify the messages over the years. We even have a very famous blogger in the room, John Aravosis. So I think my first question will actually be for Joe. I'll ask a few questions to the panelists. We'll have some discussion, and then we'll open the floor to all of you. But Joe, Paul, I know you're famous for creating the phrase the 1%. Your article in Vanity Fair, Cullen Murphy, your editor, put by the 1%, for the 1% of the 1%. And that movement, that slogan was taken up by the Occupy movement and really became the sort sort of slogan of the last few years. But Paul Krugman claims credit because he wrote about the subject in 1982. So it's interesting how these ideas come up and are then forgotten by the media and then sort of come back again. You know, we all know that changing how a problem is named or framed doesn't mean that the policy solutions will change or that anybody will do anything about it. But of course, without the information, even if it's not sufficient, it's certainly necessary. Can you talk a little bit about how you think the media has helped put the problem of inequality on the map, taken away just from the economists and into the world?
Yeah, well, I think the series, The Great Divide, in the New York Times did help a lot in highlighting the issue. It was a series that went on for a couple years, that I helped curate, that not only talked about the economic inequality, you know, the disparities between the rich and the poor in income and wealth, but also talked about the very many different other dimensions: environmental inequality and injustice, education, access to education, and access to justice. So by constantly, you know, 2, 3, 4 times a week writing about it, I think people sort of got the idea that maybe there was some inequality in the United States and in other countries. And I think that was at least part of the reason that the message got across. I think one of the reasons that the topic has resonated so much, though, is the sheer fact that inequality has grown so large. So that the media may have helped crystallize what people were feeling. But, you know, there's a sort of a natural American optimism and people feeling they should be doing well. And yet, in their paycheck, it wasn't showing so well. And so I don't know how many of you know the kind of data, but the median income in the United States now is lower than it was about a quarter century ago. And median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. And at the bottom, real wages are lower than they were 60 years ago. So these are just astounding numbers for a country that claims to be having economic progress. And it's a testimony to the fact that how much of it's gone to a relatively few people. So I think the media did play a role, but I think reality also helped play a role. And then let me just mention 2 other things that I think also helped. And all these things come together. NGOs, I think, played a very important role. For me, and they help feed stories to the media. Oxfam, every year right before Davos, publishes an inequality report, and for the last 3-4 years. And the one number that everybody talks about is that a bus in the first year they published it, was about 85 people, had as much wealth, 85 people, half of whom were in Davos. 85 people had as much wealth as the bottom 3 billion. So that number, 85 and 3 billion, sort of jolted people. And then every year since then, that bus gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this year, it's only about 66, I think, 68 passengers is all you need to get the bottom 3 billion. So, and then the media, obviously, I mean, when Oxfam reads the report, not that many people actually read their report, but it was a very cogent way that the media could pick up, and then people at Davos would talk about it, and the media in Davos would be asking everybody, and that became very forceful. And then finally, let me just say, I think some of our political leaders have done a good job. I think Elizabeth Warren has, been very forceful in articulating what has been going on in terms of inequality, and make some very powerful speeches about, for instance, that since roughly 1980, let me just pick out a date, or 81, January 20th, 81, that the bottom 90% have had their income stagnate. So those are all numbers that, again, that help crystallize that something peculiar has been going on in our country.
And how's that feeding into the elections? Is that behind the support for Trump and Sanders? Is it
Yes,
pushing
I think
Hillary
it's the
to the-
common element that's feeding into both parties. I think there are two elements that are feeding in. That's one of the elements that is really very powerful, that people are feeling a strain. And let me say, it's not just inequality. I think even more, or as much at least, is that people are finding it increasingly difficult to have what is called a middle-class lifestyle. Send their kids to college, have a secure retirement, own a home, all those things that people in the 1950s and 60s thought of as a prerequisite of a middle-class life. Those are becoming out of reach, or seemingly out of reach. The other element I think that's very important is the set of injustice. That they're feeling life is very hard, especially since the onset of the Great Recession. And yet the people who caused the Great Recession, the bankers, walked off with bonuses of millions and millions of dollars, and not a single, basically almost no banker was held accountable, went to prison. And in the much more minor wrinkle that none of you probably remember, the S&L crisis, 1,000 bankers went to prison. So something else has happened to our society, and that is the system of accountability and fairness has disappeared. We threw people out of their home in our so-called system of justice who owed no money. The banks just said they did. And they lied, committed perjury by the thousands. And then they paid some fines, but those fines were not paid by the bankers, they were paid by the shareholders. So there is, I think, a grave sense, and there ought to be a grave sense of something is unjust about the way our society is functioning. So I think those two, inequality, the difficulty of maintaining the basic middle-class lifestyle that everybody believes is part of the American dream, lack of opportunity, and a real sense, deserving sense of lack of justice of our system, fairness of our system.
Did either of you want to add anything, or shall I ask Michael a question?
I just, a couple of points that I just would pick up on what Joe said, which I was thinking about. And I would just add two things, which is one, I actually think, giving all credit to Paul Krugman, but that the problem that exists today is nothing like it was in 1982. And if anything, and I think the 1% has been a very useful framing device, but I really think it's more a question now of the 0.01% or the 0.001% in terms of that concentration of wealth. And you can see it by the Oxfam figures in that just a few dozen people. And the other point is that just to pick up and amplify on what Joe said about this hollowing out of the middle class. Because honestly, I think that people would care less about inequality, although the fairness issue I do think is important, if they felt they were doing okay themselves. But I think that's the problem, which is this stagnation of median incomes and the fact that people are working and they haven't seen any raises. And we're seeing in the economy this kind of barbell effect where there is this concentration of highly skilled jobs at one end, concentration of low-skilled jobs at another, but the middle is really being increasingly attenuated, and all kinds of reasons for that. We know globalization or the gig economy, the lessening bargaining power of labor, and so on. And I think it's that one of the economists, he was actually a conservative economist that I interviewed for a story, talked about the disgruntled employed And I thought that actually was a great phrase, because we tend to think of people who are unemployed, and looking at the unemployment statistics as a kind of real barometer of how people are doing and how the economy is doing. But in fact, people are working, but they're really not seeing the fruits of that. And I think that is what is really fueling, in terms of the election, the outsider phenomenon, whether it's Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders.
Michael, do you think that the media was remiss? Should they have seen Trump coming?
Well,
Why
I
not?
think that that question, Anya, is part of a broader phenomenon and a problem that I wrote a few notes down about that. I mean, Trump, yes, it's sort of like the white working class. How come they're gravitating to Trump? But there are a whole series of questions. Why is Sanders? Why are young women for him? And leaving aside what Gloria Steinem said, it's still an important question. There was, when Trump made those comments about Bush and the war, and South Carolina, a big military state, people were saying, like, well, is he going to get away with this? And I read an article saying, well, people in the military, the multiple deployments have so distressed families that they sort of, were willing to support that. And then there was also Trump making his reference to 2 Corinthians, and everybody said, my goodness, where are the evangelicals? It's 2 Corinthians. I mean, but they didn't care, So there are a whole series of these things, and I think that the press has been constantly having to play catch-up on this. We're all aware of sort of Joe laid out very well a phenomenon that we're sort of aware of, but journalists, in terms of the electorate, have constantly been behind. And the reason, I think, is because who do journalists generally rely on for their information about the election? Academics, their think tanks, their local journalists in these states, the pundits, and then, of course, the pollsters. I thought if I were to give a title for my comments, it would be Polls, Pals, and Populism. And the polls and the pals, meaning the politicians, they so dominate the coverage. I mean, we've had this Nate Silverization, I think, of coverage, where the polls, I've clipped these stories, and I can't tell you, this exit poll and this poll from Gallup and CNN's poll, and you have people that do nothing but pore over these and try to handicap these races. And just to read a couple things, here was on the New Yorker website, Benjamin Wallace Wells. The Clintons have lost the working class. And he has a sentence that I thought was very revealing. Careening across southeast New Hampshire, I noticed the polling places were thick with Clinton aides, many advertising her endorsement by a plumbers or pipe fitters union. So here he is careening across the state and seeing the signs for the unions. But does he ever stop to actually talk to any union person or any worker? No. Sometimes people talk to voters when they go to rallies. And here was a piece that got some attention by Ryan Lizza, who's a very good reporter for the New Yorker. And this was a very entertaining look. He went to 4 Trump rallies. But he says, I made a point, they try to keep you from talking to voters at these rallies, but he lined up 3 hours in advance at one rally in Mississippi so he could talk to people. And I actually circled the parts that are the voters that he talked to. There are 3 voters he talked to. You have no sense of really who these people are beyond their age, and sometimes you don't even get an occupation or anything. And so over and over, I feel that the press is in this bubble. This is not an original observation, but I think it's become more striking. The press, with each election almost, is more and more in the dark. And I think it's because they rely so much on other members of the elite, but the other members of the elite are equally, in the dark. Here's a story from the Times. The sudden popularity of Mr. Trump, who defies Republican orthodoxy on issue after issue, shows how deeply the party's elite misjudged the faithfulness of rank-and-file Republicans to conservatism as defined in Washington think tanks and by the party's electoral leaders. Well, he could add the press to that too, that they've also been left behind. So just very briefly, there are three big areas that I think if journalists got out more into the field, and I'm talking about deep reporting, like having somebody stationed in Iowa for months leading up to the caucuses there, or in New Hampshire, or in Nevada. So three issues. One, immigration. We here in New York, immigration, we are all basically, I don't know, we're used to immigrants. A lot of us have forefathers and foremothers from other countries. What is it about immigration that has become such a huge issue with these Trump supporters? I actually saw a recent thing that showed that, in fact, Texas, Arizona, the rate of immigrants, of the proportion of the overall population is much higher than here. So that's obviously a factor. But what is it? Is it economic? Is it the taking of jobs, the lowering of wages? I mean, Joe could talk about what the data shows on that. But is it that, or is it cultural? Is it racial? I mean, I would like to see some really good, deep reporting on why people are so impassioned on immigration. I just don't know the answer to that. Second, trade. I went to Ohio for a week to talk to voters before the 2008 election. It was a fantastic experience. And I was struck by how much people brought up NAFTA in northwestern Ohio. And it was fascinating. I mean, because here in New York, you really don't have as much sense of how that has impacted people. And I also don't know, Patty and I have had a conversation, and it's very complicated because you don't know what the effects of trade are versus immigration and so on. But again, I think somebody who hung out in Ohio for a while or whatnot could really get much more deeply into the reality of this. Is it a perception or is it a reality that trade has so impacted people? And is a big factor now with the Pacific Trade Agreement. Finally, evangelical America. Obviously a critical part of American political life. It's covered like a foreign country. It's like people going to Thailand or Tunisia and covering. I've been working on a book about religion, so I've actually, even though it's set in Europe 500 years ago, I've been paying a lot of attention to the origins of evangelicalism. And I'm flabbergasted by the lack of understanding. I was at dinner once with a New York Times editor who, this is about 5 years ago, and she was saying how great it was to have people with military experience like C.J. Shivers who could cover wars because they know so much about it. And she wanted to hire more. I said, why don't you hire an evangelical who could go out and sort of do the same type of reporting on that sector? And I just think it would be extremely revealing if we had more deep reporting on that.
Can I ask Michael a question?
Yeah, of course.
So having being part of a quantitative profession, even though I don't use numbers myself, the attack against polling I sort of reacted to a little bit, and the question is it the superficiality of the polling, or the polling itself? What I have in mind, I mean, at the Roosevelt Institute, we've been doing a lot of polling, and we haven't, but Stan Greenberg has been doing polling for us, and particularly on what we call deep polling, might be called deep polling, where you have long interviews and vignettes and trying to understand, sort of in a more precise way, what are the issues that people are concerned with. And the point is to do it quantitatively, so a random sample of 10 or 15, we're, as social scientists, nervous about. And one feels a little bit better if you have a sample of 1,000 and you've done it in a methodologically, at least we would tell our students this, do it in a methodologically rigorous way. And so, for instance, one of the things that came out of that polling was the depth of concern about trade. It is a really big issue, and it wasn't clear, even with the polling, why it was so strong. And the thing is, they didn't know fully why they should have been so much against it. I try to explain. I hope in the election to try to explain to them. But like the objection to ISDS, they don't really understand, but they do get that there's something about trade, and it really is firing them up. So your observation about that is absolutely right, and it shows in some of the polling that was done for the Roosevelt Institute.
Let me just say, I'm not opposed to polls. I mean, in fact, they've been very accurate in a lot of ways in predicting what's going on. But it's the why. It's sort of like,
No, I
the
agree.
polls are a good starting point, but you want to, they are capturing a snapshot of where the population is. But to understand why Trump is polling these numbers, or why particular demographic groups go for a particular candidate, and what is driving that, because, I mean, that's what I think our journalists should be telling us more, instead of constantly being surprised along with all the other elites.
So let me just respond to a few things that have come up here. So, obviously the media, there's huge variation. I feel fortunate to work for an organization like the Times, and recognizing that there's a lot of difference in coverage and how it is. And I don't want to be sounding like I'm defending being in this position, because let me start off by saying I actually hate most of the political coverage across the board. A lot of the kind of horse race aspect of it, I think, is a gigantic waste, and I'm not that interested in it. And so I have a lot of critiques of my own on that. But let me say a few things, which is, one, in terms of news organizations like the Times, and let's talk about assuming who's doing the best reporting. It's just absolutely not true that they aren't doing in-depth on the ground. In fact, we had a reporter in Iowa for a year, Trip Gabriel, which I would argue.
One of the articles I cited.
Right. But I mean, in terms of, you're talking about in-depth reporting, he actually lived there for a year. And we had a discussion the other day.
That's no sacrifice.
I know. We had a discussion the other day.
Joe is from Indiana.
Was that a
grew up
good
eating
use of
meatloaf.
resources? I'm not sure that actually was, putting somebody there for a year in advance. There's absolutely an obsession with the polls and counting. It's across the board in data. It's not only in political reporting, it's in every kind of reporting now. It's in journalism as well. How many people read your story? Where are they reading it? How is it getting shared? So all of those things, I think it's like any good reporter, you use whatever information is out there and you balance it. Is a poll, if you are doing a good poll and talking to 1,000 people, less informative than if you go out on a day and you interview 8 people at a rally? What is more representative? What is giving you a big
Well, I'm not
picture?
saying 8 people at a rally.
No, my point is, just as a reporter, you try and use all the information that's available. You use polls, then you go and you do interviews, and yes, absolutely, journalists, we're going to be talking to elites more, if anything, party elites, which is part of that divide between the rank and file, whether it's conservative Republicans and the party elites. But I actually think there is a lot of excellent reporting being done, and in-depth reporting being done, talking to people on the ground. I also think that, part of the problem is, even in this reporting now, when we're looking at the primary results or the caucus results, and percentages obviously are what gets reported, but if you actually also look at the absolute numbers, who are the actual numbers of voters, it's very tiny. The people participating in a lot of these caucuses or primaries is not representative of the electorate as a large. I mean, this is not just true of this presidential election, it's true of every presidential election. But so in a way, even those primary results, I think, are misleading in terms of where the country is and who's supporting who. Yes, could the media do a better job? But I also think that there is a lot of in-depth and good reporting going on out there.
One of the strands that I think I miss, quite apart from this, where is the American people and what's motivating them, is at another level, is sort of the intellectual movements that are going on. And for instance, on the Democratic side, to me, what I find quite interesting is while there's a you sort of the slight the fighting between Hillary and Sanders on one issue or another, very small differences, but asking what are the common elements of what is a broad progressive agenda. And I haven't seen that kind of analysis of what is you might say, the 2015, 2016 progressive agenda, because there was actually a lot more in common. And it really is defining a real strand of where the country is going. The second question I sort of interested that I've speculated about is what happened to the right wing of the Democratic Party? What some people call the Reubenites. Is it just in hiding? Has it disappeared? Is it dead? Or are we going to see the revenge of the Reubenites at any moment? So to me, clearly some of the actors are still there. So the question is, what's going on? On the Republican side, there's been a little bit more of this in the sense that Trump is a very interesting from a political point of view. Is there an intellectual coherent agenda, or what can you make of the agenda? I mean, there must be. Every brain has to have some coherence, and if you try to figure out the coherence of it, what would it be? And I think there are, you mentioned Huey Long, and that may be the sense of what it is. But you look at the three candidates in the three leading candidates in the Republican Party. They're very different positions. So that really asks, again, the question that has been asked frequently about what is the coalition that is the Republican Party. What happened to the business establishment? They didn't do very well in the primaries, and everybody, the money didn't buy the outcome. Will there be a new coalition that formed before the convention, after the convention? So I think these are some of the more, higher level issues about where the direction of our country is going.
You brought up a point which I've been thinking about a lot, which is this, and it also has to do with this divide between kind of the reporting on elites and what's going on in the rank and file. And the question is, does there have to be intellectual coherence? And I would say one of the things that, and I don't cover politics, but anytime that I have traveled, throughout the country and done interviews, no matter what the subject is, not necessarily the economy, but in my years, I've always been surprised at the mix of views that people have, that they don't at all fit the kind of conservative profile or liberal profile that we always talk about and use as a shorthand, that politicians talk about. Not to say that there aren't people who follow, who are kind of dyed-in-the-wool conservatives or dyed-in-the-wool liberals, but most people that I've spoken to, whether it's a mishmash on social issues, conservative issues, values, immigration, it doesn't line up. And in that sense, ironically enough, I actually think Donald Trump reflects that much more, that kind of inconsistency that most voters have. And it even goes to the point of, talk about your own self-interest. I mean, I really remember this article we had last year, and it was interviewing people who were benefiting from Obamacare, who did not have health care before, but were so against it, And so, in a way, I think this kind of, and you see it particularly among the Republican candidates now, among Ted Cruz, who's talking about this kind of conservative purity. But I don't think that actually reflects the way that voters feel if you actually ask them on different issues. And that's why I do think, this kind of in-depth, whether it's reporting or even in-depth polling that really seeks to pull out why people have the views that they do and scratch below is so interesting.
Well, an illustration of that, when I went to Ohio in 2008, I went to this town called Findlay, which I feel almost is sort of could be like the Peoria of American politics. It's 40,000 people sort of south of Toledo and west of Columbus. And it's called the flag capital of America because they make so many American flags there. But it was just extraordinary. They've always been very conservative, but there was this populism that was rising. That's where I got this NAFTA thing. And I ran into I met this truck driver who used to run goods up to Detroit and back, and the work had dried up, and he blamed it partly on NAFTA. But anyway, this is right before the election, 2008, and he said, I never thought I'd vote for a nigger, but I'm going to vote for this nigger, meaning Obama. I mean, it's like just a stunning comment, and I thought, wow, I'd like to go back and find that guy now.
Wow. Before we turn to the audience for questions, I was just wondering, Patty, as a working newspaper woman, do you think that it would be possible to cover Trump less?
I've really wondered about this because it's it's like that guilty pleasure that you just it's bad for you. It's like the super double rich chocolate fudge ice cream in the freezer. It's really bad for you, but you just can't resist it. And I mean, it's very. On the one hand, it is this kind of, I definitely think it's contributed, the fact that he's gotten this disproportionate coverage. I mean, now arguably he is the front runner, he's deserving of it, but certainly early on, it definitely contributed to his rise. It's very difficult because he's incredibly entertaining. He was saying things that were newsworthy. On the other hand, certainly in the beginning, he was getting coverage disproportionate to what seemed to be his support in the polls and such. So you could retrospectively say, well, it turns out that was an accurate call to give him that extra coverage because he's turned into the front runner and he had a lot of support. On the other hand, at the time, was that really a fair call? And so it's a really, I'm not sure myself what I think the answer to it is. I'm interested in what people in the audience think.
Credit for foresight and depth.
That's right. We had 20/20 hindsight there. But it's very hard. It's very hard not to give him a disproportionate amount of space. He does make for such good copy.
What do you think, Michael? Too much coverage?
No, I pretty much agree with Patty. I mean, I feel that you can't avoid it. I guess, again, my plea for deeper coverage, it's sort of like maybe there should be more of him, more scrutiny of his past, his business dealing.
Nice piece today in the Times.
Right.
Yeah.
Was that in the paper or online?
I don't know. It popped up on my phone
Yeah,
this
yeah.
afternoon, but
I
a lot
think
of
that's an example.
It'll be in the paper tomorrow.
A lot of the
I think
rumors
'cause-
that we've been hearing about Trump, about him stiffing people on contracts, not paying the bills that he owed, which we've been sort of hearing around New York, were actually in that story today. So it must be true.
But
if it's in the New York
it's
Times.
also, look, I'll just give another example, and I'm not saying that this was such an important story, but look at the story that we had. It ran on the front page about Ted Cruz and his taking loans from Goldman Sachs and his wife, which were not reported, which, regardless of whether you think that was a justifiable thing to do, he clearly had broken the reporting requirements on those loans. So in theory, that underscored two things. One of his portraying himself as apart from Wall Street. And secondly, in terms of, his honesty and ethics, which now, at least now, are coming around to bite him, but for different reasons. And I just feel like that story got no traction at all. Like, people just did not care about it, or voters did not care about it. And so, there is, in terms of, I think, on a lot of these things, it's not that they're not being reported. It's just a question of what has that stickiness factor? What is it that kind of resonates and then is picked up both by the media and by, by people. And if anything now with social media, the ability of kind of stories or things of interest to take on a life of their own outside of the media is greater than it's ever been previously. But, some things just don't stick.
When you see something like that you think is important that hasn't stuck, do you think you should try to find other angles to get that story out again and again? Or do you think that is sort of unfair, that your job is just to get it out there and then let the market take care of itself? The reason why I say that, when I was in the White House, one of the things that we were told over and over again is just because you've said it 10 times doesn't mean you shouldn't say it 11th time. The view was that very much, and it's just like our students. I mean, we know that the first time we say something, they didn't get it. So part of pedagogy is repetition. And the question is, do you have a responsibility to say it over and over again?
Yes,
different way,
a
but-
different way. I mean, I think if you think there's a vein of reporting to be done on a particular issue, then you have a responsibility to go down that vein of reporting. So not that particular same story, but if you think, there's, I mean, look, on every level, journalists are digging. They're digging. We don't know necessarily what we're going to find, right? But there's just places that you dig. You dig it where there's campaign contributions. You dig where there's money. You dig in tax returns. So we're kind of digging and seeing what's there. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's a problem, and I'll take it outside the political realm for a moment because as I said, I'm not a political reporter, but even on the economy, and we've had this discussion many times. I mean, on the one hand, you're a newspaper, so you're covering something new. And if I see that either, I've written about a topic or I've had colleagues that have written about a topic, the same topic in the last year, I feel like, well, we did that. So if I think it's an important issue, then I was like, well, how can I get a fresh angle on that story? What do I have new to say? And that's constantly the challenge that I think all of us face all the time is what's new? What can we add to the conversation? It's not just repeating it, it's coming up with something fresh.
Well, I would just add, we have had this conversation, but something that often gets shortchanged these days in journalism is the beat coverage. So you're assigned to something, and instead of just doing some big outtake, you're covering something regularly. So 2 examples, one totally in a different area. Alan Schwartz. Does anybody know who he is, New York Times reporter? He's the guy who covered concussions in football. And he was not an investigative reporter. He was a beat reporter who got interested in concussions in football. And he wrote in 4 years 100 articles on this. And he almost single-handedly put this issue on the map. So instead of doing one big takeout or 2 or 3, he just kept at it. Another example, and this gets to a larger point that I want to make, is a mutual friend of Patty and mine, Jason DeParle, in the late 90s, asked, if I have this right, asked the Times to send him to Milwaukee to cover welfare reform and poverty. And as I understand it, they were sort of like, should we do this? But he did an incredible job of covering that and also putting poverty on the journalistic map, or rather giving it the ongoing attention it didn't have. And that's another issue. Even we here are sort of, poverty is not really discussed. It's the working class, the middle class, 50 million poor people, I think, in America. And this story that has come out, this new book, Matthew Desmond, about eviction that is getting all these reviews. There was a big profile in the Times today. I mean, this ethnographer from Harvard is uncovering this phenomenon that has sort of been hidden from us in many ways. And again, that's the lack of talk about poverty and what to do about it. Now, Patty might say that you can cite all these articles that probably have been in the paper, but again, I feel that's gotten shortchanged.
I think, and this, first let me deal with the question about beats and then poverty. So the question about beats is the entire paper at most newspapers that I know of or anywhere I've worked are all organized in beats. And I could give you dozens of examples where that's the case. I mean, and I'll just take, because she happens to sit next to me, is the reporter who has done the thing on airbags, Takata airbags and the fact that they explode. I mean, she has done dozens and dozens of stories digging on this. I was actually so impressed. At her desk, she has these binders, these really thick loose leaf binders, but they're really like fat ones, where she keeps her research organized of like every single person who's made a complaint that she's been able to track down, and filed and such. And so that, that's an incredible story that's been over and over again. And that's, anyone can tell you, I think any reporter, editor at the Times would be the very first to say that covering a beat is how you get the best stories. It's only by that, day-to-day coverage. You don't find the big story unless you're covering it on a day-to-day basis. The question on covering poverty, I think, really gets to the larger questions you were talking about, and that's the theme of this, is how you frame issues and frame them in a way that resonates. And whether you're talking about inequality, in a lot of ways, the issue of inequality and the question of the disappearing middle class are the same issue. So when I first started covering this beat, which was about 18 months ago, it was kind of the tail end of Occupy Wall Street. There was a lot of talk of inequality, and that became the kind of nut graph frame thing. Then Obama, in his State of the Union, not this one, but a year ago, I think it was a year ago, talked about the middle class. And suddenly then it was the disappearing middle class, and we did a series called The Disappearing Middle Class. But I was writing about the same thing I had before about inequality. I just was framing it differently. And now when Bernie Sanders came up, the conversation has reverted to inequality. And so I've also done a lot of stories about poverty, but in a way that resonates much less than right now inequality or the disappearing middle class. So there are different, in a way we're writing about a lot of these same issues, but you're looking for the best frame in terms of getting something that's going to get traction. And
that's right. I mean, the ILO will tell you they can't get anyone interested in stories about labor conditions, so they've had to rebrand it all as trafficking. Because trafficking is what people are interested in when it's just plain old labor abuses a lot of the time. So I think that's another example. Should we maybe hear from some students in the room? I see we have alumni, which is great, and adjuncts, which is great, but maybe we'll start with some students. Anybody want to ask a question or make a comment? Yep, in the back.
My name is Devanj. I'm from the School of Journalism at Columbia. So I just wanted to know, New York Times wrote an article recently about how a lot of economists are saying Sanders' plan is very unviable and all of that. So I'd like two comments. One from you about what categorizes majority of economists. I mean, that's such a vague generalization in general to make in a headline especially. And from Mr. Stiglitz, I'd also like to know whether you agree with that characterization.
We may have to put Joe on the spot and ask him the Bernie-Hillary question. I think there's been a lot of anger about that letter, and I've certainly seen a lot of emails this week from economists who felt that they weren't spoken for and feeling that they need to rally around Sanders. So that's been quite controversial in economic circles, and it's a really good question. Patty, did you want to go first?
So one is, we don't write the headlines, number one. So I don't remember exactly what the headline was on that. But, it's in a way, it's a dodge. Whenever you're writing any story, how do you characterize? Is it some economist? Is it many? Is it most? Clearly, because there had been this analysis out there, there was an economic analysis out there that painted a very rosy picture of what I think most, and I will use the word most here, and I'll defer to Joe, of 5.2% growth, which is far beyond what any projection is. And if any Republican had put out that kind of growth projection, in fact, when a lot of the Republican candidates, Jeb Bush and others, had put out even lower growth projections, they were roundly criticized as being too rosy. So the fact that there was this economic analysis, what was seen as a very optimistic or overly optimistic economic analysis out there, and you were hearing from even sympathetic economists that this was out there. So I think it was a legitimate story to do. Was honestly, I would have to go back and kind of read it more carefully. Was it qualified sufficiently in terms of really getting across that, well, here's a handful that we talked, a handful of people who were interviewed. And I really do try myself to be cognizant that, even if I spend an entire day and I'm talking to a dozen economists, that there's dozens more out there that I didn't talk to. And so, was it as carefully qualified or characterized as it should have been? I don't know. But I think it was definitely a legitimate story to write about.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, if any candidate puts forward some kind of projections, then clearly it's the job of
Sanders
journalists.
campaign did not put it forward. He was
his-
independent, but they were citing it.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's the general problem with that particular statement is the extent to which it was say a commitment. Jeb Bush said he was going to get growth up to 4% on a sustained basis, and that got a lot of reaction. This was a statement about funding of a particular program and was based on if we grew this way, there'd be no problem. That goes to two broader issues. One, the candidates are under enormous pressure to come up with detailed programs that will, to some extent, bind them when they're in office. And the fact that you have such active media today recording everything they say means that if they don't do what they say, there will be a split-screen TV show where they say what they said today and what they said before. So it makes it very embarrassing. And I would say most candidates, most presidential, feel committed to fulfill what they've said, even if it was misspoken. But the challenge, the difficulty is that the reason you have an organized government is that these issues are often very complex. And you have a huge bureaucracy out there. I mean, I see that in a positive way, that are trying to weigh different concerns and to come up, look at the numbers, and they're really difficult, many of these issues. And it puts an enormous burden on the presidential candidate when they start filling in a lot of the numbers and the details. So, looking across candidates over a long period of time, it is actually striking. Hillary is probably the most prepared, as the strongest staff, with the ability to fill in those numbers. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable as a presidential candidate that she is that qualified, has that strong of support. Most presidential candidates can't come anywhere near to having that kind of filling in the details. And that causes all kinds of problems. They had for instance, one of the debates was on the financial sector reform. And Bernie Sanders talked about reenacting Glass-Steagall. And Hillary said the real problem was the shadow banks. And the right answer is you need to do both. So why were they fighting? To me, if they had asked me, I would say, you need to do both and more. You know, and you can say, well, I think this is the most important, and the others, you know, that's okay. People can say this is what I'm going to focus on. But I think one of the really hard points for the press is then to say, was this a big mistake or a small mistake? You know, they blow it up because you get a lot of people making news out of it. And then some economists who are supporter on one side say, oh, you made a mistake. And they almost like, you know, it impugns the economics profession to say 5.2%. And, you know, people make mistakes, and I don't think, my own view is that one should be fairly tolerant about those kinds of details, but not tolerant about sort of the overall direction of policy.
Fair enough. Any other questions? At some point, I'm going to cold call on Michael, too, who's been following the election so closely. So think of something clever to say. Yes, in the back.
I'm Robert. I'm a MPA student at SIPA as well. I'm interested in the sort of self-perception of Americans and how that plays into the election. So studies that have shown that the top 5% of income earners, many of them believe that they are middle class. On the other end of the spectrum, many people living in poverty think that they're not that bad off. How much do you think the sort of perception of yourself and how well off you are is playing into the election, and how much of a factor that is in addressing income inequality?
Well, I'll just talk about the middle class because actually it's one of the pieces I did for the series that we did last year about the disappearing middle class was exactly on that question about how people identify. And, you know, that's always been the case in American society that, you know, even up to not even the top 5%, it's like the top 1% view themselves as middle class. I mean, one thing to recognize, of course, is that there's huge regional and state variation. So, you know, what it takes to be middle class in New York City, given cost of living and such, is different than what it takes to be middle class in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or someplace else. And so a lot of times when we're using national statistics, they can be a little bit misleading. But certainly I think that's very much tied up with this Americans' identity, and I think that is definitely responsible for a lot of the political phenomenon that we're talking about and the rise of both Sanders and Trump, or the anger and unhappiness out there. Because, you know, really, if you look at the unemployment statistics, you think, wow, things are going pretty well. But, you know, clearly there's a deep reservoir of disillusionment, and I think that has a lot to do with the way Americans view in terms of their prospects for the future, as well as the way they view themselves as part of the middle class.
Yeah, let me just add two things to that. One aspect of that middle class is a sense of opportunity, upward mobility, and just like the reality of the attainment of what was a middle class lifestyle is becoming more difficult, and they know that, and therefore they had a conception, you know, sort of defined when I was in grade school. We had these readers in first grade and kindergarten, first grade, second grade, you know, see Spot Run, and all the pictures were of a middle class lifestyle with, nice married couple with a daughter and a son, a dog, a cat, and a green lawn. And there are a whole set of upward aspirations that were defined as part of that. And they finally, 20 years later, they're figuring out it's not true. And I think, to me, it's been a surprise it's taking so long. And I think I would say it's something about a characteristic of American optimism. But I think the reality is beginning to sink in that life is not so good. So to take one aspect of upward mobility, it's getting a college education, and now it's more and more difficult to afford it. In the average, student loans, big problems with student loans, average graduate, $25,000, $30,000, and growing very rapidly. So all of that is, I think, the disparity, the dissonance between their identity and the reality that they see for themselves and their friends is a big thing. And the crisis made things work. I mean, no one thought you were going to be middle class and lose your home. And yet millions of Americans did. I mean, just so it wasn't the kind of person you were. And if you see some of the films about it, you can see that kind of tension between who they were and what was happening. As a little bit of a digression, a lot of that is showing up in other aspects of demographic statistics, marriage, the incidence of marriage among the lower lower third of the population in income is decreasing significantly. So there are other aspects that are correlated with this. The final observation I wanted to make is for those who come from other countries, particularly from the UK, middle class has a totally different meaning. And so you would want to talk about working class if you were a labor leader. No American politician would talk about a working class. That would be sort of derogatory. I mean, of course, everybody works, but so the language is different in the two countries that speak the same language, and that sort of, I think, makes it more difficult for sometimes for foreigners to understand the peculiarities of American politics.
Great. Any other questions? Any alumni, students? Yes, in the back.
Hi, I was just wondering, so Donald Trump's famous for having multiple sound bites, and one of them is that he's going to bring jobs from China, he's going to make America great again. So I was wondering, Professor Stiglitz, what's just your unfiltered response to that, both politically and economically?
Well, one of the things that I find so interesting and striking about Trump is that he makes all these statements about what he is going to do or what we will do as a country without saying how it's going to happen. So what the chain of events that will link his assertion that we are going to do this and how that is going to be brought about is a total mystery to me and probably to him. So I think, I think he thinks if he bosses China around and say, if you don't do this, we will get really mad at you. Something will happen.
We're probably going to use tariffs, right? Isn't that sort of?
I think he probably has forgotten that there are international law. And so if we raise tariffs, they would have the right to raise tariffs on us. And we have an international frame and there's a legal frame on doing a lot of the things. And he can't do a lot of the things that he says that he can do. And the consequences would be very, very different from what he thinks that they would be. I don't, a lot of things you have to get through the Congress. I mean, we still have a Congress, and it isn't clear that he could get a lot of those things through Congress as well. And then we have a litigious society, and there would be suits. So actually, I'm a little, I would like to hear his more concrete plans to figure out which of those would be illegal and which of those would, under domestic law, international law, where he would have political problems getting, whose axes are going to be gored. But the problem is he doesn't give the specificity. We were talking about before being specific. Well, I mean, but he doesn't even give a frame, so you don't even know how he's going to begin doing that. And the obvious things, as Michael said, would be raising tariffs, and you can't do that.
It'd be a trade war,
It would be a trade war, and that would be interesting and give us some more data, and you know, for Patty, it would be a lot more stories on her economics beat. So there would be a lot to write about, but it's a little bit hard to see how he could do any of the things that he says, you know, like including, you know, having Mexico pay for this wall. I know a lot of people in the Mexican government. I haven't heard them enthusiastically endorsing that idea of any wall, let alone paying for it.
Michael, were you about to say something?
You just took my line. I was going to ask you how you would get Mexico to pay for the wall. So
Good. Yes, Esther, please. Professor Fuchs.
You know, I have lots of questions, but I want to stick to a question first about the media's role in the coverage of the election. So one of the things that's puzzled me is why we think the outcome of these elections should have been predictable to begin with. And so I think, you know, from what I see as part of the problem has to do with the cycle of, you know, it's not even a 24-hour cycle, it's a 22-minute cycle of needing to create some sort of analysis of what just happened, which we know can't really tell us anything about what's going to happen. And so, you know, I'm wondering what the media's role has been in here in sort of misleading, you know, us in terms of helping us understand what's going on. I mean, but the only clear thing to me about this election cycle is that it was completely unpredictable. And I think that, you know, from looking at the political science literature that I'm familiar with, I would make this argument now as we're going through a realignment maybe, and that's possibly why, you know, the parties are really diverging, standing for two different kinds of things ideologically, and there's a huge group of voters who don't identify with either of the political parties. So something interesting coming out of the polls is this high number of independents. And so as a consequence, if you have that, things are much more likely to be unpredictable and less coherent ideologically, if there's such a thing as ideological coherence. So I'm wondering what the media role has been. That would be my question to the media folks here, in kind of hoodwinking, you know, us into thinking that we should be understanding what's going on now instead of sort of letting it happen and waiting for the outcome in some sort of rational way. I don't want to use the word rational.
No, but what you say really resonates, and but I guess I would just actually extend it in terms of explaining my comment before about why I hate a lot of the political coverage. It's the same critique I've had ever since I've been following politics, 25 years, or worked at newspapers, which is it's all about, when I say the horse race, it's all about prediction. And I feel it's an enormous waste of resources and space. And here it's nice to actually make an analogy with economic forecast, because the one thing that we know is what economists are absolutely terrible at of forecasting recessions. They've what is it? What is that saying? They forecast, 9 out of 5 past recessions. I think there's way too much that there has always been, certainly as soon as we've had modern polling, and that the more that political newspaper organizations, media organizations now do their own polls, and I think it's, there is an interest in it, there's a demand for it, but I think there's way too much focus on what will happen as opposed to explaining maybe some of the things we were talking about before and why they're happening or what's happened, because we're all bad at predicting the future. And it's a conundrum, and I to even shift it, for instance, I cover, or a group of us cover the jobs report. It comes out every month, and when there's a certain formula to doing it. I mean, the jobs report every month comes out at 8:30, and at 8:32 you have to have a story up. So you've prepared a lot of it in advance. And one of the things that I had noticed in all the previous stories, they always would say, well, here's Wall Street's, or most analysts, there would be consensus forecast in terms of what the unemployment rate or the number of jobs created would be. And then in the second paragraph always it would be, well, did they was it above or below, and that became the benchmark. And to me, this was ridiculous because all that said was, well, maybe all the analysts were wrong, and why were we using that as a benchmark for saying either it was good or it was bad? And so, this was an argument, and one I actually won, saying I don't want to put that in my jobs report because I don't think that's meaningful. But it's very hard to get away from that. And, it just so much of the coverage is now, we all see it. It's the expectation. Trevor Noah did a really funny bit on The Daily Show about Marco Rubio came in third, I guess this was in Iowa, and he won because, and the guy who came in first didn't win because it was below the expectations. And so that definitely creates a narrative that I think is not good.
I want to defend a little bit more social science because I think we
I want to say the numbers are valueless here, so I don't want to be quoted, in that camp. But I think economists have a lot to do with this idea somehow that political scientists can predict.
No,
They adopted that model, and it doesn't work, is what we find out. They predict the past, basically.
Yeah, but I think two things. One is we always do want to know what's going to happen. And so, and when we're wrong, and even when we're right, but particularly when we're wrong, it gives us a framework for thinking about why we're wrong. What happened? Why is 2016 different from what has been the historical pattern? So, for instance, economists, political scientists, had a not terrible track record in predicting the outcome of presidential and congressional elections on the basis of unemployment. If they use that number in the number that they had, that kind of regression, that kind of statistical, in this election, it'll be disaster. Why? Because that unemployment rate today doesn't mean what it meant in 2012. There's a lot of disguised unemployment. Now, that's a case where we know that nobody would do that today because they know that the labor force participation rate is low. There's a lot of disguised unemployment, so it would be foolish to even try to do that. But that would say, and then there are other studies that look at things like wages, and you say, well, that's really what is probably going to be more important in this election. So one of them is that, I do think the discipline of trying to think about what have been the forces that have played a role in the past is useful, and then using that as a way of distinguishing what is happening today from those past past experiences.
I think that's useful too, but I don't understand why nobody noticed this big rise in independent voters and the possibility that, this wasn't going to be one of those elections in which the past was predicted.
Yep.
We can't even figure out who's going to turn out anymore. So that was always what we did well. And I've done public opinion polls for years and been involved in that. Part of it is, Obama mobilized a whole sector of voters that nobody thought was going to turn out. That's how he won. Trump's voters are not the so-called
That's right.
normal voters in the party. So something different is going on in the campaign out there. And I think, part of the way we study elections is not helpful. Not helpful to the reporters, but not helpful to even our understanding of how the present is diverging from the past.
Yeah, but I think
A variable in a regression analysis, and I see my friends tell me, oh yeah, well, when all the other demographic variables don't explain anything, it's the campaign. Well, I want to say, excuse me, but open up that box. What does that mean? Nothing in the way you're using it in your model.
Yeah. No, so I think what's interesting about this election is that it is saying that our society is being put through some unusual strains, and that's the kind of things that Patty's been writing about, and I think that's why. I think the interesting question is this is a more interesting election than normal, and I think it's corresponding to our society having been put through strains that are worse than normal.
Yeah, just very quickly, speaking in defense of the horse race, I thought I would never say that, but this has been a remarkable election. And in some ways, this has like been a remarkable exercise in democracy. I mean, I watch these debates. You know, in Europeans, I'd like to come to the panel. I mean, from the stories I've seen, they're like in awe. Of course, Trump is great coverage anywhere. But again, though, I feel it's a deep, it'd be interesting to see if anybody in either a newspaper or magazine or a book sort of like, really found this populist uprising that has occurred and managed to detect it. And there's an interesting question now, like what would we want to be reported now? I tried to lay out some areas, but it's interesting to think not only how we've sort of failed in the past, but what should we be doing going forward?
Yeah. John Aragosis is here, who's a well-known blogger, so maybe we'll.
Real quick, I'll defend the horse race. I mean, personally, I find it interesting anyway, but I think our elections are so long, compared to Europe, like you said, which I know better than other countries. The fact that we start a year or two in advance, per se, we want to know what's going to happen. That's the whole point of an election, right? Is who's going to win. But I think going back to what you were saying, I did my graduate school at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service, and one of the things, and probably you guys have gotten this too in terms of your studies here, we had former CIA people teaching us saying, which sounds kind of funny, but their estimate wasn't necessarily wrong, even though maybe they predicted something that didn't happen. At the time, they were right. In terms of all the facts they had did point to something going that direction, but then things changed over the next year or two. And when you've got an election that goes on for a year or two, of course, we're going to think that Hillary's going to win, which is what people did think in 2007. I was living in Washington at the time, and all the time, everything in the media was Hillary, Hillary, Hillary. And then Obama all of a sudden took over, and then the Obama people were complaining that, then the Hillary people were complaining that, oh, you're all saying it's Obama all the time. And things change. And so I don't know to what degree we can predict it. It's kind of, I don't know what I'm sort of trying to get as a conclusion, but I just feel to some degree, of course, we all want to prognosticate, and maybe just the nature of the beast is you can't do it that far in advance because, and the final thing I'll throw to you, both you two especially, to what degree the media is actually influencing what's going on. Because who do you pick to cover then? If we're going to say, well, no, it's never going to be Trump, it's not going to be Bernie, so let's not cover them. Well, then will they do less better in the polls?
Right, well, that has always been a case in terms of choosing it, but I guess, right, of course, we want to know the horse race. I guess the point that I was making, which is about the predictions, is that the predictions become too much a part of the narrative. And so success or failure is seen in terms of the predictions, and I think Hillary Clinton's problem both in 2008 and 2008 and this time around is you can't be a front runner for 2 years. And part of the whole problem, I think her problem, is that it was inevitable, and when everyone 2 years in advance was kind of anointing her, that the only thing to do was to knock her off the perch. And so, probably her doing really poorly now would be the best thing to help, because it's all the expectation and the prediction, and I don't see any way around it. I'm just saying that I think it's, you become part of this.
Yeah.
It becomes part of
Do you think you could cover Kasich more?
I think it's, the question is it, now it's getting harder, because now, we've got Super Tuesday coming up next week, and things are really kind of going to shake out. So I think the questions are much more difficult early on when it's hard to do, and part of it comes to, and again, I was not involved in those decisions, but I know part of it has to do with funding, right? Who's getting campaign money, who's lining up the people who are helping the campaigns, who's advising it, and I think all of those things go into decisions about coverage.
A lot of people have caught my eye, so I'm going to go around the room. Professor Ergis.
Yeah, I have a question that has to do with the sort of the image of America in American elections and the way that's playing out here. Because when we think about both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders as representing two forms of populism, and I think that may be true, but they're also representing two very different ways of thinking about the relationship between America and the rest of the world. And what has struck me, so it seems to me that Trump, mobilizes a well-trodden, well-known kind of America first, let's call it that, ideology. But what has really surprised me is that Bernie Sanders hasn't come in for more criticism as representing a socialist, more European-friendly kind of perspective. And that when Rubio, said he would make a great president of, I think it was Sweden, that was like one line, but it didn't go very far. This sort of the non-American credentials of Bernie Sanders, the difference of Bernie Sanders, has not been a really big issue in this campaign. And I'm wondering whether that tells us
By the fact that he's
way
Jewish.
Americans- and the fact that he's Jewish. I mean, maybe anti-Semitism has not even, has gone out of fashion, but it might have been an issue. And I'm wondering whether something has changed and we could reflect on these two different ways of interpreting the relationship between America and the rest of the world, because I think Sanders is saying we have something to learn.
Well, David Brooks actually had a column this week, or last week, about how if Sanders got elected, we would become like Denmark. And it was like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine anything like
Danish
worse.
Consul General in the room, I'm sure. Just want to point that out.
And so that to me was an example of how he's being left behind by the Times, not the New York Times, but by the Times. And I mean, you're right, because, well, Trump is the ultimate, right? I mean, who would think he could get away with all the things that he has said? I mean, beginning with Megyn Kelly in the first debate, and well, even before that, about Mexicans. And I actually am surprised that people have not pressed him more. I mean, in some of these discussions, like,
Yeah.
don't you think that by doing this, you are, going to lead to much more racial hatred in this country? Or his Muslim statements, don't you think, I mean, how about Muslims get attacked? And somebody like is citing you. Will you feel, will you feel somehow responsible? And I feel there's not been, and there has been some. Some of the interviews are better than others, but I feel there could be a lot more of that.
His supporters cheer when he threatens people with physical violence. I mean, I keep saying Oswald Mosley and the Black Shirts of London,
Did
or
you hear what he
Golden
did
Dawn.
yesterday?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really terrifying. Someone's very patiently in the blue sweater. I don't know your name.
My name's Jack. I'm from the journalism school. Talking about the Sanders effect, if he doesn't win the Democratic nomination, are we going to be talking about inequality come October and November?
I think that Sanders has had an enormous effect on the discussion and the discourse that's happening, both not only among the Democrats, and clearly he's had effect on Clinton's positions, but in general. And so even if he doesn't get the nomination, I think I think you'll hear Hillary Clinton taking up a lot of those same themes. So I do think it'll be quite potent.
I think it's very, very strong in the Democratic Party as it's constituted right now. And that reflects, one way of thinking about it, look at the voters, the people who've been supporting Sanders. They are reflecting, saying that there's something about that message that's important. Hillary obviously sees that. So they've read that message very strongly. I think even if it had not been for Sanders, she would have been pushing those issues, but not quite as much. So I think that come October and November, in October, they will be talked about. Now, the exact language and how that's framed will depend a lot on who the candidate is in the Republican Party and how that gets, how they're framing the debate. But it almost surely will be, in part, the language of inequality may not be used as much as the language of what's happened to the middle class lifestyle.
Yeah. I see Alison Silver, opinion editor at Reuters and former opinion editor at Politico. Did you
Yeah,
comment?
I wanted to speak out in defense of polling, since everyone feels wanting to beat it up. I want to say three things. First of all, in both 2008 and 2012, you had polling that was right on it. You had someone like Nate Silver, but there were also two other people at least who were right on the figures that ended up. And I think there are two things I would say, there are many things that have happened, but two things that have happened are, one, this referral to independence. Independents aren't what they once had been, which is that they're actually independent. You have people who are saying they're independent, but they vote conservative. Or you have people who are saying they're independent, but they vote Republican. I'm sorry, but they vote Democratic. So more and more, when you have independents, they aren't pure independents the way everyone thinks they are. And I think you also have they're undergoing a transformational moment because it's harder and harder to reach people. And I think they're in the process of trying to figure it out. You're hearing polling over the internet, which is has some problematic aspects. You have polling, people trying to reach people via cell phones. That's also kind of complicated. So I would think they haven't quite sort of straightened it out. But I mean, even in Nevada, the polling of Latinos has been questioned now over and over again, where they're saying the methodology was wrong, or they're saying the sample wasn't big enough. So I think they're in the process of trying to figure it out, and that's what's happening. But I want to speak up for polls.
And I see Michael Cohen, who taught journalism, broadcast here for a long time, and was a broadcast journalist for many years.
Thank you. So you were all talking about some of the more egregious things that Trump has said, and I think we'll all agree that there's plenty of entertainment for all to see. But what about some of the really shocking, dangerous, sort of quasi-fascistic things that are going on, and that might go on if he actually does become president? Thinking about what might happen in the arena of international affairs. Do you think that the media has done a good enough job at expressing an appropriate level of alarm about what Trump really represents?
Actually, I think yes with Trump, but not with Rubio. I feel Rubio is really, and it's almost entre nous here, so I don't want to, if anybody wants to speak up and think we're distorting it, but from abortion to use of military force to also the hatred that he feels for anyone who does not sort of subscribe to conservative principles, and the disrespect for President Obama, which clearly to me seems to have a big racial component. And I feel that because Trump has absorbed so much of the energy, that he's gotten away. But as he rises, I think perhaps that will change.
That's right.
Well, actually, Paul Krugman had an article yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, about, basically if, all of those issues that you mentioned, that he'd be a crank, but now he's the establishment crank because you've got Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump has been. So first, let me say, I don't think it's, again, the media is large. A lot of people do different things. As a reporter, I'm not in the business of opinion journalism. I'm in the business of reporting, so it's not my job to express outrage at what anybody says. It's to report it. That's other people can do that, and I think a lot of people have done that. So, in the media and outside of the media. I think what's important is to report as fully and well as you can in terms of what they're saying and the implications of that, and that goes for Trump. And I agree with you in terms of Rubio, who has been somehow portrayed as more moderate in his views, but actually, if you looked at a lot of them, there's not really that much difference between what he and Cruz.
So we have two alumni who caught my eye, but before I call on them, I'd like to know if there's any students that want to say anything. Yes.
I'm just wondering, we're looking at these elections just from the point of view of America, but if we compare that with Spain, with Greek or with France, where Podemos or Syriza or the Front National is winning power is it's not the kind of relation, and we are just in front of a global change from a political
Yeah.
view.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a really interesting question. See, I think part of the answer to that is that some of the same underlying forces that are driving the United States are driving what's happening in Europe. So you have the high unemployment rates, the high inequality in Spain, Greece, Portugal, and high youth unemployment, in Italy, and so I would say that the failure of the market model in a very fundamental way for a very, very large fraction of citizens in all these countries is a common force that ought to drive people to say the parties that believe in that old model have something to explain, and that somebody and if you have parties who said that world is working, they're out of their minds. So to me, they're both representation of the same underlying forces. The main difference is that in Europe, some of the failures were done by center-left parties. But that was because they were too centrist. And that was because they were too committed to a German-dominated Euro. And that was inevitable that was going to fail. So, and they didn't mean, they hadn't thought through the economics of what it meant to be tied to the Eurozone and to Euro. And if they had, they would have realized they were tying themselves into a economic agenda which is different. And then I guess the final thing is, both in the United States and in Europe, it's rejection. I mentioned this a little bit in my earlier remark. It's rejection of the I refer to the Rubinite school. The right wing. We used to call them closet Republicans. The in the Democratic Party. It's rejection of that the Blairites in the UK. It's a statement that very centrist Democratic Party doesn't have a lot to offer young people. So I'm glad you're finding some unhappiness with that.
It's also on the right, of course, right? The National Front in France and what's going on in Britain.
That's right.
So like the right-wing populism we have here is being mirrored.
That's right. And we'll have a panel in September when Joe and a few other people have new books out about the euro. We're running low on time. So what I'm going to do is take I'm going to group a few little questions and comments. We have Jim Holcha, who's a SIPA alum, who's coming back to teach speech writing this spring. Why don't we go with you first, Jim? Did you want to say something quick?
A quick question. That's actually apropos of the previous question. Are the European media covering this election better from the perspective of inequality? I lived in Europe for several years. There's no illusion about being middle class like there is here in the United States. People identify with a particular class. Are you finding in talking with your colleagues in Europe that maybe they're handling the election a little bit differently?
Did you want to take that, Michael?
Actually, I'd like to hear the answer to that. I don't know enough about it.
This is a good lead-in for the fact that in October or September, we're going to have our foreign correspondents cover the U.S. election panel, and we always get a few foreign correspondents. I'm taking names if anybody has suggestions, and they come and talk to us about what it's like to cover the U.S. elections, and clearly it's very different. I read The Guardian a lot, and I don't know, did you have something to say? Because clearly their coverage is very different from ours, and their coverage of Black Lives Matter and police brutality, and they've always had a sort of beat of crazy, terrible things the American right does. And I would say that beat is finding sort of full flowering right now. So that's what I follow. I don't know. Elizabeth Pellicella, another Columbia alum, did you want to? And there were a couple students. Did you want to say anything, Elizabeth? No. Okay, were there a couple students? Last word always goes to a student in the house. No? Yes, green sweater. Thank you. What's your name?
I'm John. I'm a second-year student here at SIPA.
Great, thanks.
My question concerns kind of the intersection of income inequality, the media and politics, through
QE, which has been widely cited here in the U.S. and abroad as exacerbating income inequality, if not by making the poor poorer, but because the gains have largely gone to the wealthy. Equities, those gains go to the wealthy. The unwinding we're going through now with the Fed's balance sheet, overnight repos, the profits are going to the banks. And there's, of course, a counterpoint to that. It says it didn't exacerbate income inequality. But for the average citizen who has no clue what QE is, but does understand the transmission mechanisms, the fact that they can refinance their mortgage or they can get an auto loan for a lower rate, has QE shaped the politics, or unconventional monetary policy really, shaped the politics of this country in a way indirectly through those transmission mechanisms when they turn on the news and they see that mortgage interest rates are at an all-time low and so on and so forth. They may not understand monetary policy, but they understand the transmission mechanisms and how they affect them. Has that affected the politics? And by virtue of that, has that affected the election?
That's for you. That's an
No,
economics
well,
question.
that's a good question. I think in general, more broadly in the United States, the Fed is viewed as a evil institution. So trying to say that the Fed did anything good is an upward battle. And that's particularly because the governance of the Fed is so problematic. I mean, it's really embarrassment for a democratic country. So I think the issues that are probably more resonant than the economic issue of that it relies on trickle-down economics, that the mortgage rate has come down because not that many people are getting a new mortgage. It's only a new mortgage that would be affected. And a lot of the benefit doesn't trickle down even to the new mortgages. I think much more resonant is the continuing the view that is controlled by the big banks and that the banks are evil. So just one example, and I'm sure it didn't resonate at all, the Washington Post picked up a questioning in the congressional testimony of Janet Yellen that was, I think, probably a response to an op-ed that I and one of my former students wrote, pointing out that for the first time beginning under Bernanke, we paid interest on reserves. And that was tens of billions of dollars that we gave to the banks. And we never did that in the past. So to me, that's the kind of thing that's more likely to be picked up, and more likely to be picked up on the right, because there is if you go to the Midwest, if you go to large parts of the United States, there is an enormous anti-Fed media, mostly radio, but there are whole radio stations devoted to how the Fed is ruining your lives. So which you don't get here in New York. So I think the bottom line is QE is not going to make much of a story, but the Fed will remain to be controversial because of the bailouts, mainly because of the bailouts, but now because of the money the tens of billions of dollars that we're giving the banks, and because of the peculiar governing structure where the banks run have such a large role in the governance, and then of an institution that bailed them out.
Let me just also add that every left-wing economist that I have ever interviewed on this subject is against the Fed raising rates. So I think people, on the one hand, recognize that it has exacerbated inequality in the sense of huge returns to the financial sector. At the same time, they're looking at unemployment, that half of the Fed's role, and they think that it would damage or would hurt the recovery of people getting jobs. So it's actually kind of the reverse. People on the left who are activists are against program-based civil rights.
By the way, this book has a whole section on nutty conspiracy theories in American political life and how they're transmitted through the radio. So it's quite an old. Mike, I recommend it. Michael, do you want the last word before we close?
Yeah, Joe, these Midwestern stations that are so anti-Fed and the sense that they're helping the big banks. Is there actually, do you feel there's a movement out there, and Patty, you might move forward, to actually break up the banks? Is it a right populist position to also, that seems to me that that's one of these contradictions where you have people rail against the banks, but only a Bernie Sanders type would really support it.
Oh no, there is strong support on both the left and the right for breaking up the banks and reinstituting Glass-Steagall.
Those are two different things.
No, they're two different things. But I'm just saying that
Because the one seems much more radical to me. Has any Republican candidate supported it?
Oh, not any candidate, but
There's the
I've
Federal
been
Reserve
in.
Transparency Act that Rand Paul has introduced to Congress to reform.
That's right. That's on the governance. So that's more in the governance.
But look what happened to him.
But what I wanted to say was that I testified in Congress and you know with the heads of a couple of the regional Federal Reserve banks from the Midwest, from Texas, and they are very critical of the degree of concentration in the banking sector.
And wasn't there a Midwestern governor who just came out for breaking up?
That's right. The head of Minneapolis Federal Reserve came out in favor of breaking up. So there, I'm not sure whether he's on the right or the left or in somewhere else. But the point is that there is actually a very a congruence here between the left and the right on this particular issue.
Terrific. Great. Well, on that cheery note, I'd like to point out that we have wine and soft drinks, so I hope people will stay and chat and mingle. And I wanted to thank all of you for coming out on this horrid rainy night and our terrific panel. It was a really lively discussion.